Welcome everyone to the second session of our spring series this year. I'm very happy to introduce you to Rían Boyle, who is a final year PhD student at Trinity College in Dublin, supervised by Dr. Mark Faulkner. And her area of research is mostly in computational approaches to the Old English corpus, but also extends to monsters, the tree bark, and other things of Old English literature. She'd like to draw your attention to an upcoming conference paper in Leeds this year that will be on named entity recognition in the Anglo-Saxon corpus. And that is a project she has been working on with her colleague, Madeleine Rose. And yes, so you're very welcome to join her in Leeds. And today, Rían will talk to us about Discourse Necromancy, Methods in Old English Cultural Analytics. This paper will explore how digital methodologies have been thus far put in practice and also propose a novel, reproducible, and we all like the reproducible part, I think, approach for conducting cultural analytics within the context of Old English literature.
Hello, everyone. As has been mentioned, my name is Rían. And today I want to talk about, well, a couple different things, right? So I want to talk about cultural analytics a little bit. I want to talk specifically about how we can kind of apply cultural analytics to Old English, which is quite complicated in a lot of different ways. And as was mentioned, I really want to show people how this can be done, or at least how to engage with kind of more computational study of the Old English corpus. It's a lot easier, that part anyway, is a lot easier than it sounds, I promise. But anyway, so this paper is going to kind of cover a few different sections, and I'll try and get through everything. I do have a tendency to overfill my presentations, so I'll move through it as best I can, but hopefully we'll get to everything. In any case, I want to kind of, just to make sure that we're all on the same footing, I want to go over some of the work that's being done kind of in this space in Old English already. Where do computational methods come from in one way or another? How are they being used at present? Just so we're all aware. I'm sure many of the people in this room already know, but I feel like I ought to go over it anyway. Then we'll get into the real meat and potatoes of the thing. So this is kind of two different parts. As we mentioned, I'm in the fourth year of my PhD right now, so I want to show off a little bit some of my results, some of my findings to kind of demonstrate the applicability, the possibility space, if you will, of this kind of research in Old English. And then crucially, I want to show you how to do it. Very, very basic introduction, very, very simple. I would like to say, though, I might at certain points say my methodology or something like this. I really want to stress that this is not my methodology in the sense that I've cooked everything else up or cooked everything up from scratch, right? And I've taken bits and pieces from a lot of different researchers that are working in this space. Not all of this is new, not all of this is novel, but the application, I think, is quite new. I don't know if anyone's tried cultural analytics with Old English yet. Anyway, that out of the way, let's actually get into the thing. And I want to start with this quotation, which actually has nothing to do with Old English whatsoever, unfortunately. This is from 2011, and from an article, The Quantitative Analysis of Culture Using Millions of Digitized Books. And I want to start here because I think it really neatly illustrates the growing interest, obsession, let's say interest with data and computational processes in well, the arts and humanities in general, right? As we move throughout the 21st century and we get more and more technological tools available to us, and the kinds of things we can do and our interest in data really expands. So this article, what they're referring to here, this corpus that they reference, is a corpus that is, I believe, to the best of my memory, about 4% of every book written. I think maybe every book in English, and of course by the time of 2011. And they say the corpus cannot be read by a human. If you tried to read only the entries from the year 2000 alone at the reasonable pace of 2000 word or 200 words per minute without interruptions for food or sleep, it would take 80 years. The sequence of letters is 1,000 times longer than the human genome. If you wrote it out in a straight line, it would reach to the moon and back 10 times over. So that is a tremendous amount of data. And I'm so obsessed with this quote because the scale is almost the point, right? And that's kind of what they're expressing here is look how big it is. Look how much data we have. And certainly in the modern period, we do have a huge amount of data to study, right? And the question of how do we deal with this much data is at the core of cultural analytics. I'm going to take a drink of water very quickly. Excuse me. Does this still work? Does. So what is cultural analytics? I don't know how familiar everybody is with this at present. It's kind of a set of theories or an approach to studying contemporary culture. You'll see that in the quotation here. That was put forward by a guy called Lev Manovich. And what Manovich is interested in is actually studying visual culture. Excuse me. So think magazines, posters, every single day in the modern world, thousands and thousands and thousands of images get uploaded to social media, or just to the internet in general, not even social media. And how do you engage with that from a cultural perspective, or as kind of a critic or a researcher in culture and cultural production? How can you possibly wrestle with this? And so cultural analytics is kind of a set of different things that Lev Manovich puts forward as a possible solution. Critically, Lev Manovich is interested in contemporary culture and visual culture. And some of you might be thinking, Old English is neither contemporary and what I do certainly is not visual, right? I work with Old English texts. And so this presents a little bit of a problem, but of course, kind of since Lev Manovich first put forward this idea of cultural analytics, it's mutated and adapted beyond the confines of what Lev kind of originally put out, right? So it is being used for kind of the study of textual cultural production. It is being used on slightly older bodies of work. So, you kind of have studies in like the dissemination of classical sources in early modern literature, for example. That's one article that I saw just off the top of my head. But the early modern period is kind of where it stops. It doesn't really go back much further. Likely because medieval data is quite tricky to work with. So what I want to try and do is think about, well, how can we do something like this for medieval data? And obviously, of course, for me, for Old English data and Old English texts. We don't have the same scale, but we do have a sizable scale. We've got one decent corpus that we can use for kind of this at scale kind of approach. And kind of the key into that, or certainly what I would suggest is the key into that is by engaging with corpus linguistic methodologies. I realize I'm kind of throwing a bunch of different methodologies and approaches and so on out pretty early on, but these things all kind of intersect in a pretty neat way. So I might at different points in the paper variably refer to things as corpus linguistics, computational, cultural analytical. I'm talking about generally the same thing, which is at its core, this process of taking a large amount of text, right? So in our case, all of written Old English, surviving Old English, right? Searching that corpus for different words, extracting the data, and then applying all of these different kind of statistical measures or different ways of thinking about and visualizing and counting the data that's presented. So you have n-grams and collocations, which I imagine we're all familiar with. And just for the sake of time, I won't go too into it. But an important thing with corpus linguistic methodologies that I'd really, really like to highlight is, as much as the word methodologies is up there, I've read a number of corpus linguists who really prefer to call it maybe a field, or maybe not a field. it's pretty disparate. It's highly flexible. It's used in a wide array of different contexts to achieve different goals. It is not limited exclusively to the study of linguistic data or linguistic or asking linguistic questions, right? Highly, highly variable. And you have a number of different corpora that all accomplish different things, right? So you can have corpora for modern American English, modern British English, modern Hiberno English, or indeed different kind of contexts. So the language of the internet, the language of Twitter, the language of Facebook, the language of Wikipedia. I'm really interested in all these different kind of COVID-19 corpora that have come out that are used to talk about, news reporting on COVID, scientific articles on COVID. These are all different corpora that can be used to study functionally culture, right? And cultural production at this point in time. And we have a number of corpora featuring Old English. So the earliest that I can find, please correct me if there's any others out there that features Old English, but the oldest that I can find that features it is the Helsinki Corpus of English Texts, which was a corpus designed for the study or the historical linguistic study of English, right? So it takes kind of equally sized samples across the history of the English language to compare change and so on. And then we ought all, I imagine, to be familiar with the YCOE, which is a corpus of Old English prose, and the YCOEP, a corpus of Old English poetry. So this is kind of the context in which my research begins, really, is attempting to conduct cultural analytics by engaging with large amounts of textual data, searching them, extracting data from them, and analyzing it thereafter, right? And it's so flexible that I do think it's appropriate. Now, when I think about the corpus study of Old English in particular, I kind of divide it into two different camps, just for myself. So one is studies on lexical units. Okay, so that's actually looking at the word itself, studying the word, the frequency of the word or set of words, where they appear, how they appear, what they look like, the characters, the spelling. Um, and this has been quite popular. So I, of course, have to shout out my supervisor, Mark Faulkner, and his work on corpus philology, which is, using these methodologies um, to search through the corpora for different words, and by using spelling variation, kind of answer philological questions, right? So we can see that engages with the lexical unit, the item, the word itself, right? Furthermore, there's efforts in stylometry. So stylometry, looking at style. This article from 2007 from Gill, a stylometric analysis of King Alfred's literary works. Very interesting piece of research, trying to attribute different texts to King Alfred based off of computational corpus-based study. This article had some issues that were raised by Janet Bately, but it's still kind of a good article for putting forward the possibilities that exist here, but also highlighting, I guess, the need to really closely engage with the actual sources that you're using. You can't just rely on the computer for everything in this space. Source studies, so Battles uses n-grams to kind of map sources across different Old English poems. But then I imagine what most of us see and the corpus being used in is just as supplementary material, right? So all of this work is looking at the function of different lexical units in studies that are closely engaged with that as the core question. But very often you'll just find articles that kind of even in a footnote will say this word appears only once in the entire corpus, or it appears 12 times or 20 times or something, as just an extra piece of context, an extra piece of information that broadens the contextual horizons of what's being studied, right? But all of these critically are engaged with the words. How many, where, why, so on. You also then have studies in lexical meaning, right? Again, taking this corpus-based approach where rather than just looking at the word on an individual level, you're trying to get at what is the word actually talking about? What's the context the word is being used in? And a lot of this that I've found is in kind of studies in emotion and so on. Using corpora and computational approaches to pull out a huge amount of sources that kind of express emotions in metaphorical ways and cross-compare them to really interesting ends. I, of course, also have to reference the work of my friend and colleague Claire Poynton Smith, who recently finished her PhD, which uses this is same kind of approach, but to look at the language of chastity in lust in Old and Middle English saints' lives. Really, really interesting stuff. But you might notice that I have some amount less examples for lexical meaning, or certainly a smaller range of examples for lexical meaning than I do for studies on the lexical units. And I think that's because fundamentally, this is studying lexical meaning is really, really hard from a corpus-based perspective. Because what the corpus is doing when you engage with corpus studies, you tell the computer, I want to find a word. Find me every time that drikten appears in the Old English corpus. And you hit the search bar, or the search button, and the computer shows you everything that you need to see. But what it's showing you is lexical units. So the input is lexical, and the output similarly is lexical, and that's all there is. For lexical meaning, you need to dig a little bit deeper. You need to jerry-rig some solutions. And for cultural analytics, and indeed with studies in lexical meaning, we are interested in both the function of the unit and the meaning of the units, right? Or the appearance, the frequency of the unit, and the meaning of the unit. So we're trying to do both, which is pretty hard. And I shouldn't have attempted to do it, but nevertheless, here we are. So, further difficulties that I just very, very quickly want to raise when dealing with Old English in a corpus linguistic kind of capacity. First and foremost, you have the issue of spelling variation. Again, I imagine we're all pretty familiar with this, but the fact that words are spelled differently really boggles the computer's mind. It cannot handle the fact that words are spelled differently. Because at the end of the day, computers are in fact very, very stupid, right? So to go back to that example of drikten, if I tell the computer search for drikten with an I, it'll show me all the times it appears with a Y, but we know from understanding Old English that it should appear a decent amount of time with a Y instead of an I in drikten, right? And indeed, there might be many other variations that might be slightly contracted. The ending might be slightly different. There might be inflectional endings. There might not be a H. There might be extra letter. There might be a C. And so you'd have to search for all of these individually if you wanted to account for all of them, unless you can find a better way to do it. And that's really what I'll be talking about. But additionally, I just want to talk about the impact of additions and editors and also biased data sets, just because you know, all of the corpora that we currently have available are based on editions. We know that editors, sometimes these texts were edited in the 19th century, and sometimes editors can make choices that really impact the reading of the text, and that might not necessarily be accounted for. It really removes nuance when you kind of take these distant, more computational approaches. You lose a lot of nuance, which can be quite a problem, and so it's just worth keeping that in mind when you're working with it. Furthermore, biased data sets are just really a problem throughout pretty much all historical linguistics or historical corpus linguistics. We do not have all of the texts that maybe once existed. Probably, maybe we do, but probably don't. And what we do have is also biased towards one section of society much more than the others, right? Which is a problem in a fashion for studying culture, right? So when we're looking at Old English and thinking about cultural analytics in Old English, we're really thinking about the culture of the literate, often monastic, heavily Christian contexts. And this can be accounted for and dealt with, but it's just worth keeping in mind, right? That it is not the kind of super neutral, billions and billions of word tokens that you might find in a corpus like in the Twitter corpora and so on. I'm just going to check the time. Oh my God. Okay. Let's motor on through, shall we? So this is where now we're going to transition slightly more into the workshopy thing. I will do my best not to sound too much like a teacher or anything, because that's kind of gross, I think. We're all smart, nobody, but let's get into this. So in order to do corpus linguistics, naturally, you first need a corpus, right? The corpus that I tend to advocate for cultural analytical purposes, or indeed for a lot of purposes, engage in corpus linguistics with Old English, is the Dictionary of Old English Corpus. And why? It's the most complete that we have access to right now. According to its own website, it has at least one copy of every Old English text, which leads to a corpus of size a little over 3 million words and over 3,000 texts. There are a number of different releases that one can use. So there's the 2000 version, which is critically accessible for free for research purposes from the Oxford Text Archive. This is the version that I use because it's accessible, because it's all there in machine readable file formats, and it's free, which is very nice, right? It is out of date though, but the extent to which it's out of date is relatively minimal. The 2009 and 2024 versions use slightly different texts and have more texts, but those lists of texts in the edition versions are all available on the DOEC website, I believe, certainly for the 2024 version. So this is the corpus that I use, certainly. And to search it, one can use the browser-based DOEC search. I imagine that, again, many here are familiar with this particular little screenshot that I've taken of or from the DOEC website. So they have this little search the corpus bar up top, and really usefully, capital A can be ash, capital D can be thorn or eth, pardon me. And there's all kinds of restriction and filter options. They additionally do have some, they kind of nod their head to spelling variation with the wildcard search. So you can see this is an example taken from the DOEC website. If you wanted to search for the word lecken, but wanted to account for some spelling variation, you can use these kind of asterisks, right? Which tell the computer anything can be here, right? So L something something something, CGEN something something something, and you can get lecken and licken and lickende, so on and so forth. So this is accessible from the DOEC through their browser, or through your browser, I should say. It's really great. This is a really, really powerful, very, very functional and accessible tool. But it has one or two issues when you're trying to get an accurate a source or an accurate a search as possible. So I have thrown a word up the top here, lekjan, which is just a form of letgen. And as you can see, there's a double G and an A that are not there in the base form. And the search, this wildcard search, this L star CGEN star, would never capture this spelling, right? And in fact, there's not really a good way to capture this spelling using wildcard search, because you're going to have to start adding in a whole number of asterisks, and that's really going to dilute your search results, right? You'll end up getting all these false hits that you don't want. Maybe not in the case of Lecken specifically, but not all words look precisely like this, right? So you have to account for spelling variation. If you want as accurate a result as possible in a slightly different way, you kind of need to wrestle the corpus away and start doing things yourself outside of the browser, outside of the tools that are kind of open and available to us right from the beginning, right? So as I said, this very basic process that I'm about to describe is found across a number of different studies, but this is how to do it in a detailed way, right? So how do you account for spelling variation? Well, number one, you need a corpus. Great, we're going to use the DOEC. You also need corpus software, and then you need regular expressions. This is the beast. Regular expressions are the really scary part, that are probably the most difficult to explain, but I will do my best here, right? So, regular, oh, and of course, 2000 release, the DOEC, accessible, machine readable, free for research purposes. Really, really great resource. So these are regular expressions. These are, I think, what I get the most questions about when I talk about this methodology, okay? But the basic principle behind regular expressions is it's a way of representing text in a way that accounts for variability within the string, right? It automatically accounts, or not automatically, but it accounts for variability. And that's what matters, because we've got a lot of spelling variation. So all of these different terms, richt, richtes, richt with a Y, richtliche, rectia, richtra, maybe all different, slightly semantically different, richt and richt, I and Y variation, of course, not that semantically different. But all these different forms of richt, if we want to capture all of these, or only some of them, we can use regex. or regular expressions for one single search. No need to go back, no need to use complicated or, slightly inaccurate wildcards. Um, I realize that the string that I propose here is the example of this will capture all of these. It will capture all of them, but sitting here looking at it, there's a couple of improvements that could be made, which I probably should have caught before starting this. But nevertheless, a slightly inefficient string, which doesn't really matter. It works, it does the job. So regex continued. What's actually going on here? So this will demonstrate some of my thought process into how and why I create certain things. So highlighted in yellow there, you have the word boundary. You always need to introduce some kind of word boundary just to tell the computer, this is what I'm interested in. This is where the word begins. Take everything from here, right? Word boundaries can go at the beginning or indeed at the end, and it accounts for all manner of stuff, right? Full stops, question marks, spaces, exclamation points, little punctus, punctus elevatus, whatever it might be, the word boundary can handle it, right? Green, then this is accounting for a set of prefixes, so you could get anricht, onricht, jericht. I want all of those. But I could collapse this and make this slightly better. Then in pink, that's going to be the first character. And you can see I keep, for anything that could be at the start, I give it in capital and lowercase form. What I'm doing there is I'm telling the computer, can be either one of these, give me both of them, right? Blue, then, this is one of the most important things, is accounting for variation in the vowel. Obviously, some of the greatest mutations are going to occur in and around the vowels. So IEY, very common kind of set of mutations. Unfortunately, though, there's no kind of rules for this. You can't say, oh, well, I've seen an I, so that's always going to variate into I and E and Y. It's not necessarily true. Often it will, but you need to have a strong understanding of the kinds of spelling variations that you're going to see. And there's a couple of resources out there, VarioE, for example. The Dictionary of Old English also has a list of possible variants, but they don't always account for everything. Red, then some non-standard consonants. So richt could have a C in it, it could have a G in it, and I just wanted to capture those. But you'll notice the HT is completely unmarked. That's solid. That's never going to change. Or that's what I'm telling the computer anyway, right? I'm sure there's definitely some spellings of richt that don't have the H or something like this. I haven't seen them, but I bet there are, and they're taunting me. But what if I want to write regex, which is kind of the goal here? That's what I want everybody to go away and do after this. So I get a lot of questions about regex very often, but functionally everything that I do in the most basic sense, there's many, many, many different regex operators out there, but these are the ones that I use, and pretty much everything can be done with this set of operators, regular expressions, whatever you have. So this \B, that's how you define the word boundary. Like I said, your space, your full stops, your question marks, anything like this, are all encapsulated within /B. And so you put that at the beginning or the end of the word to define where the word begins and ends. You'll note actually that here I don't have a /B at the end, so I leave the end of the string unbounded. That's because I want all these funny endings. I want the inflectionals, I want the liche, I want the ra, I want all of those. And it's just easiest to leave it unbounded. Sometimes though you will need to bound it on the end, and find other ways of accounting for different kinds of endings, right? The question mark is critical. That basically means 0 or 1. So again, to go back here, you have to take the AA at the beginning. I'm telling the computer the word can begin with an A, but if it doesn't, that's also fine, right? I'm obviously expecting most of them not to, but some of them might. And so I'd say, if there is an A, give me that. If there isn't an A, give me that too. A full stop is any character. This functions very, very similarly to the asterisk that we saw before with the wildcard search from the browser-based search, pardon me. Everything in square brackets then is a list of possible characters. I'm going to go back again. So you have in the light blue there, the IEY. So that's in the position after or. There will be a vowel that is I or E or Y. That's what's being told to the computer there, right? It will be one of those. It won't be many of them. It will just be one. And it can be any of them is what's being told there, right? Sometimes though, that's kind of insufficient and you need to use these round brackets with a pipe. So the example that I have is the thorn eth. If that was in square brackets, you would be telling the computer this can be a thorn or an eth or a t or a h. By representing it this way, you're telling it it can be thorn or eth or thorn or th. I hope that makes sense. This took me a while to wrap my head around initially, but it makes sense. Plus then is one or more. So I use this for events where there might be a doubled like consonant in the middle or something like this is where I most often would have to use that, right? But this is it. This is all of regex. Using these operators, you can pretty much write any word in Old English accounting for all of its reasonable spelling variations. You're never going to catch the truly bizarre, the scribe has lost their mind type of spellings, but this will get you pretty much everything that you can think of. And that's it. That's all there is to regex. I promise it's not that hard. How are we for time? Okay, I'm going to speed up through now these last little bits, and hopefully I haven't bored you all to death with my egghead discussion. So of course you're going to need to search things in Corpus software. There's a couple different options, but really I just recommend the use of AntConc. That's what I use. That's what a lot of people use. Lancsbox and Sketch Engine are options, but I find that they don't account for regex in a way that I like. There's ways of doing it, but it's imperfect. Sometimes very, very talented kind of, I was going to say computer scientists, but people who really know a lot about computers can use regular expressions to kind of mess with stuff on the back end of a computer. So some software limit what regex functionality they have. And Conc, though, you can search for all manner of regex and it just works. Version 4.4.0 or version 3.5.9, both great, both thumbs up. And those are both accessible from the AntConc website for free. I've really tried as hard as possible to design this methodology such that all of the independent pieces are as freely available as possible to do the very, very basic stuff, right? The actual searching of the corpus is entirely free and accessible. That's the goal, right? So AntConc, if you've been to a paper of mine before, you've definitely seen this slide already, so I do apologize. This is what AntConc looks like, right? And just to talk through a couple of the elements over on this side here, those are all of the corpus files. So there's about 3,000 of those. Here we have the search bar, so you can see where it says search term, that's a little obscured, but you can see I've ticked the regex option and I've entered a string of regex. This is from, I think, the first year of my PhD. This is quite an old string. The computer will then search that and will produce this set of results. There's 199 instances of the word uncouth. That's what I searched for in Old English. I don't know if I would include the eyes anymore, but nevertheless, 199 occurrences of uncouth, and these are all represented here, and you can scroll through them and read them. And critically, what you can do is you can click on any one of them. So if we clicked on the first one here, Davigan sa eilda uncouthliche siketan, if you were to click on that, it would take you directly to where it is in the text, right? And then you can read all around it, you can read the context around it, and that's really useful for getting at that lexical meaning, right? Everything else is great for studying lexical units, but when it comes to lexical meaning, unfortunately, you do kind of have to sit down and read a lot of the time. That's still very important. So that's how you do it. I'm going to whiz through now, just showing off some of the stuff that I've done with this. And by way of very brief introduction, what I work on is social norms. So I'm trying to ask and answer the following questions about social norms. How are they discussed and represented in Old English literature? Where are they present? And what concepts are of the greatest interest to them? And to answer these questions, because we don't really have a single source for Old English norms, right? We have a number of texts that all express kind of different normative positions, and what's more, the norms expressed in Beowulf will not be the same as the norms expressed in one of Wulfstan's homilies, right? These will be fundamentally different normative systems, but what I'm interested in is, are the way in which they're discussed similar, or can you identify patterns between all these different normative systems that exist in Old English texts, right? That's the question. There's a number of different kinds of norms. So you've got the very direct, you must not, you are allowed, I command you to, so on and so forth. Um, Evaluative statements. So that was a good king from line 11b of Beowulf is expressing a normative value around the actions of Schildchefing, right? That was god König. By describing Schild as good, this kind of sets up, by passing that evaluation, that sets up a normative paradigm for kingship in the text of Beowulf. Now, that norm might be limited exclusively to, the norms of heroic poetry, but it's normative expression nonetheless. Then you also have norms that are just very direct references to law and custom, right? So this is from the letter to Brother Edward by Alfred, that jeda Englishan theos forletas the jaure fedras heldon, that you have abandoned the English customs that our fathers held, right? We can read this and we can investigate, well, what are the English customs? Clearly, there is a knowledge that English customs are a thing, that our fathers held. All these things mean things, as do the surrounding context, of course. These are all my regex strings. I think I have about 42 words or so that I search that are across these three different categories. So when I analyze normativity, I'm looking at norms as a whole, but then I also break things down into permission, evaluation, and custom language, right? I assume that these will perform differently, but maybe the data will show that they won't. And these are my words. If anyone is interested, I can absolutely provide you with a more full word list at some other point. Here are some fun stats, or certainly I think they're fun. When you break it all down, permission has are almost 7,000 occurrences, which is heavily complicated by the verb leitan. Leitan means to let, to allow something to happen. Pretty important to the idea of permission. But unfortunately, you also have a number of occurrences meaning to let blood, right? From medical texts and this kind of thing. So that kind of complicates the permissive stuff, but you have to manually filter these things, unfortunately. Evaluative language then, 11,000 or 11,500, all over 6,000 of which are forms of Richt. About 9,000 of them are forms of Richt and Unricht. Unfortunately, evaluation is a very complicated category, so I really had to orient it around Richt and Unricht, right and wrong, right? Fundamentally, that's what people are talking about when they pass evaluation on norms, but you miss out on a lot of metaphorical evaluation of different normative ideas, right? Sacrifices unfortunately have to be made just because of the kind of work that this is and the complexity of dealing with Old English data. Laws and customs, then you have another 10,000 occurrences, and in total, you have almost 30,000 occurrences to read, which is just shy of 1% of the total corpus, engages in some capacity with words that could be considered normative, right? So how in God's name are you supposed to deal with all of this? An excellent question. Thank you very much. So you can break things down. So this, what I have up on the screen right now, is a histogram of manuscript dates in particular, not composition dates, for the number of words in the DOEC, right? So we can see there's not a huge amount of words from 450, little spike in the middle of the 9th century, and then whoosh, suddenly up we go into the late 10th and early 11th that then swiftly drops off post-conquest. Not hugely surprising. I imagine if I asked anyone in the room, they would probably draw a graph that looks a little bit like this. But what we can do with this then is we can compare the occurrences of all the different kinds of normative language, right? So it's very difficult to see because all the lines are kind of clumping around each other. But in a sense, that's a good sign. It means that the trends of word counts or the distribution of word counts aligns relatively evenly with the distribution of normative language as a whole and the language of customs, the language of evaluation, and the language of permission, right? There's a broad alignment, but there are some areas of divergence which you can investigate statistically. I'm going to spare you the boring details of how I calculate normalcy or normality even with QQ plots and percentage error and all this kind of stuff. I'm very happy to share, but honest to God, it would take too much time. But you can start looking at these things quantitatively, numerically, to break down, where and really when are these, or is this kind of language occurring? And you can see the date ranges here. These are the notable. Anything with a Z score higher than 2 is significant or notable or worth paying attention to. Um, and something that stands out as a little pattern here is periods of political turmoil. 875 to 900, you kind of have the establishment of the Danelaw after the reign of King Alfred the Great. And then in evaluation here, you have an emergence of evaluative language between 1025 and 1050, which would be a little bit after the conquest of Ethelred II and the victory of Canute I, then 1075 to 1100, of course, after the Norman conquest in 1066. There they are. I didn't have to pull those out at the top of my head. Yeah, sure. Okay. Nice work remembering the slides. We can ignore the customs and permission scores here, mostly just because in customs, you only actually have maybe 1 or 2 texts. And this is a critical issue with engaging with numbers in this way, is sometimes the numbers don't lie, but they're wrong, right? This 1 or 2 texts is an outlier and need not be counted in this capacity, right? I'm not ignoring the occurrences from this period outright, but just in this capacity. Similarly, permission language, the manuscript dates are well after the Anglo-Saxon period, so we need not necessarily think about that too hard. But what's going on here really is so you have this very neat little pattern that you can trace, but when I dug into it, it's not necessarily an engagement with political turmoil. It's not that after this political turmoil, you have these spikes in normative or evaluative language telling people what's right and what's wrong. You just have a lot of outlier texts. Between 875 and 900, there's very, very few manuscripts or texts written in these manuscripts produced, except for Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, which is the single longest text in the DOEC. Some longer texts are split up into a number of books, right? So the History of the World is split up into several books. Historia Ecclesiastica is split up into several books. So norm language here is being heavily impacted by one single very large text. And similarly, in evaluation, you have a large number of Psalter glosses produced around this time, or certainly that's when the texts in the DOEC were produced, or the text that the DOEC is using. And so these numbers are just based off of outliers. So you can get very interesting results from computational study, but you still have to engage with the actual text afterwards to understand what precisely is going on. This, additionally, the fact that this all says nothing is still relatively interesting. One might expect normative language and the language of evaluation, right and wrong, to increase in these periods, right? After major periods of political turmoil, you want to reestablish an identity through law and through normative systems. But that's not really what's going on here. Norms occur throughout relatively evenly the entire Old English period, which is interesting in and of itself, right? You can do a number of things with genres then as well. So looking at the kinds of texts that are written, and overwhelmingly what shows up is that the kinds of texts are texts for an educated, literate, monastic audience with a focus on regulating authority, right? Telling people with authority positions what they can and cannot do. And there is indeed a heavy prevalence of Wulfstan of York. Those laws and institutes ecclesiastical are just the institutes of polity and the canons of Edgar. Pardon me. I am coming up to my time, I think, so I'll keep going. You can look at the distribution of texts. So these are the texts with the most normative content in them. Again, we can see a very, very heavily prevalent, or a heavy presence, pardon me, from Archbishop Wulfstan of York. A number of these texts all have some connection, including the most normative text, if you will, this text Judex, which I believe is a text about how judges ought to act. It's not specifically known to be written by Wulfstan, but the manuscripts it's found in, it's kind of nestled amongst a bunch of Wulfstanian homilies and other texts, right? I'll talk very, very briefly then about collocations. You can use collocations to very rapidly read a number of texts to identify what customs and norm language are interested in, right? Instead of having to read 1% of the entire corpus for this, you can say, okay, well, show me the word theos, and then show me the words to the left and right of theos, which would be these words here. And then you can pull out all the interesting nouns and adjectives and verbs if you care. And so for Theos here, you might have, well, English on Theos is interesting. Abandoned your Theos, abandoned your customs is interesting. And your father's customs are all these interesting ideas. And so you can count these and then use a assortment of collocation strength measures called log dice to see which are the strongest collocates. What are the concepts, the ideas, the words of the greatest degree of relevance to custom language. Um, and then you can rank all of these, put them in a wee list, and we can identify some trends. So you have aspects of faith emerging very closely, judgment and people all showing up, as well as a couple of others idea, life and sin also. I have since actually included the word leaf there as the 11th strongest collocate uh, in people as well in that category. Um, I certainly believe that there is a paradigm that you can see here where norms come from faith, are then kind of interpreted and administered through the language of judgment, and then end up reflecting on people. There's that paradigm there. I have a number of quotations here that kind of, I think, demonstrate this really, really nicely. But given that we are kind of 10 to the hour, I don't know if I will necessarily have time to go into it. So what I'll do is I will just kind of skip right up to the conclusion, right? So I have some comments about norms that unfortunately didn't necessarily get to show off in kind of their fullness. But I pinky promise I'm pretty sure I'm right and that I'm not just lying to you. But to talk about the computational side of things very briefly, um, I want to stress that what the computer is good at is it's good at identifying big pictures, right? It's good at looking what is happening most often. So naturally, normative language is being used most often to reinforce the very basic paradigms, this hierarchical authority that I think we would all associate quite closely with Anglo-Saxon Old English life, right? Um, it's very good at pulling out the big picture ideas. It's very good at looking at kind of normative systems or any part of language in its totality, but it's very bad at finding the interesting, teeny tiny little bits, right? It furthermore can produce a lot of negative results. This is an advantage, though, I think, right? An advantage of this entire process is you go into it with less bias, you know? You look at the data and you say, data, tell me what I should be looking for. And you investigate the dates and you maybe expect something interesting. I certainly expected something interesting to come of the dates, but it proves not so much, right? Most importantly, though, and what I think this kind of has the greatest potential for, in terms of any of your own use cases, if you're not so interested in cultural analytics, is improved source identification, right? If you want to pull out in the most accurate way possible all the instances of a certain word, where it's used, how it's used, I think that this provides a much more accurate, it's slightly more laborious, absolutely, but I think it's much more accurate. Um, and lastly, of course, there is still a relatively long way to go um, on all of this. It could be improved so much. I am one fool kind of stumbling around in the dark trying to work out the best way to do this, but it could be hugely improved with additional resources, with additional research, by just improving the kind of the corpus itself. Much better work could be done here. And I hope you have some sense of kind of the possibilities of this, right? This is very new, very young in the grand kind of scheme of the field. Um, but I think it's really, really exciting. I'll also end on this. These are some useful links. That's a link to the OTA, the Oxford Text Archive to access the DOEC, a link to where you can download AntConc, then some helpful stuff with regex, the basic operators, and also a really nice little tool to see, is my regex going to return what I want it to return? And I think that's it. I think that's everything I have. So I'll will I stop sharing? I'll stop sharing for now and I can bring it back up if people really want. So thank you very much.